Thank you very much for joining us. This is Sovereignty Podcast number 3. This will be live on the 1st of September. And we're delighted to have David Robertson with us, the Reverend David Robertson from Australia. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to my co-host, Elaine Hill.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone, tonight, and welcome, David Robertson. I'll just tell a little bio of you. So you're a Scottish Presbyterian minister and religious commentator. You were the minister of St Peter's Free Church in Dundee in Scotland from 1992 until 2019. And you served as a moderator of the Free Church of Scotland between 2015 and 2016. And you're a blogger and a podcaster and a writer, so multi-talented. Can you give us just maybe a little sort of resume beyond that on what brought you into becoming a minister to start with, and subsequently all the time you spent in Dundee, and then why the move to Australia?
Sure. Well, I became a minister because my attempt to become Prime Minister failed. People regard me sometimes as a failed politician. In Christian terms, I would say it was something I believed that God had called me to. I was very surprised. I was minister up in Brora for 6 years and then in Dundee for 27 years. But after 27 years, I was very, very surprised to be asked to come to Sydney. And my initial reaction was not positive. But then as I reflected on it, I realized that I was doing a lot of things in my work. How I would describe it was I was the kind of guy, I was trying to get people interested in Christianity in a post-Christian society, which is how I would regard Scotland. And I was, I don't have a plan. I just do trial and error. So I was the darts player throwing 12 darts at the board and hoping 1 or 2 would stick. And laterally, all of them stuck. And so I felt that I couldn't continue doing what I was doing. And I wanted to do a particular type of what we call evangelism, but which to many listeners may sound horrendous. But it was just a way of getting people to discuss the Christian faith. And then, of course, the main reason was I needed to get away from Dundee because that's where Ewan lives. So,
okay.
No, Ewan and I've always admired Ewan. So, I was really, really sorry to leave Dundee. I love Dundee. I think it's Scotland's great unsung city.
Absolutely.
So what was the calling to Australia then? Do you have ties with Australia? You've got family there, or?
Well, I've got family. Different? I've got a son who's planting a church in Dundee, and I've got a daughter in Edinburgh who's a nurse in Edinburgh. So I've got family, most of my family back in Scotland. My mother's back in Scotland. I have a daughter in the Blue Mountains here, but really it was the church here, and I was asked to come and work with an organization called City Bible Forum. That didn't really work out, but now I'm working with, what's called, I'm a Presbyterian minister, but I'm working for Sydney Anglicans, mainly in the center of the CBD. So actually right now, I'm recording this from, I have 2 offices currently. I'm recording this from probably the oldest church in Sydney, in Australia, actually, St. Philip's. So, it's a fascinating work, and it's a fascinating city.
Yeah. I've got family in Sydney, and I have been, and it's really, I loved it. I loved it there. Fantastic. So can I just ask you then, we're obviously we've come out of the COVID pandemic thing to some degree here, but it's been very interesting following what's also been going on around the world in terms of how different countries have dealt with the situation. And it appears, certainly from our point of view, but I'd like you to elaborate whether this is the case. It does appear as if Australia has been a particularly strong militant police force presence with regards to the COVID rules, the lockdowns, all the things that went with that. Would you agree with that statement? How has it actually been over there for everybody? And do you feel they've been really, really coerced into following the rules because they've been scared for their lives quite often? What we've seen.
Yeah. I don't think that it's been a strong police thing. Now, it depends where you are. We need to understand Australia. You need to understand it's federated. So Victoria, I think, is an incredible police state. But I don't think New South Wales was as bad as Scotland was. We personally, our freedoms here weren't as restricted as I expected back in Scotland. However, where it really hit home, one was in public meeting, and that was for a while. It wasn't that long. The other was in travel. So I wasn't able to travel. I wasn't able to go home for my father's funeral, for example, or my daughter's wedding. And that was horrendous. I also think that initially Scott Morrison made a great call, and for which he was never thanked. And in that, he banned travel from China, and he recognised where the problem had come. And for a while, Australia seemed as though it would be able to keep COVID out. But at the end of the day, nobody was going to keep it out, not even New Zealand, And so it seems to me that we started off like the UK with what I would call nudge theory. The idea is let's scare people so that they'll behave. And actually, Australians have surprised me. I thought they had what they call here this larrikin spirit. And no, they don't. They're as compliant as any other country. And I'm ashamed to say Scotland as well. And the government used nudge theory to scare people. And now it's coming back to bite the government, because after a while, either people are just terrified all the time, or they no longer believe the government. And personally, I think in general, the whole COVID situation has been disastrous, not least lockdowns. I think lockdowns were iniquitous. And I also think mainly because they harmed the poor the most. If you're in the northern beaches in Sydney, a lockdown means you're locking out other people. You've got the beach to yourself. You've still got all your fancy food and plenty and all. But if you're in Western Sydney and you're in a multi with, a single woman with 3 kids, and you're not allowed out, that's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And to me, and that happened all over the world. And I think that personally, there were certain aspects I'm fairly ambivalent about the vaccine, though I think they lied about its effectiveness, but I've taken 3 vaccines. I won't take the 4th. I think the mask wearing stuff was utterly ludicrous. It was entirely psychological and nothing to do with preventing the disease, other than reminding us we're in the middle of a serious disease. I think social distancing and stuff like that was essential, and good ventilation was important. But I think the effects of lockdown will be worse than the effects of COVID, and I think that's already being seen in the UK.
Yes,
sure.
yes,
absolutely,
for certain. So how are things there now? Is it it's loosened off a little bit there now, hasn't it? Is it?
Nobody cares. I mean, yeah, well, I came in on the train and you get this, it's hilarious. You get this notice coming over, which is typical of officialdom. Masks are compulsory. You'll be fined if you don't wear masks. And half the train aren't wearing masks. And the ones that are, they're around their necks or something.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in that sense, it's farcical. But no, this is how we should have treated COVID from the beginning. In that, I think most people here have probably had it by now. But it's now treated like flu. In fact, flu is now a bigger killer here than COVID.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that you're already priming it for that here now as well in the papers.
Yeah.
But, anyway, over to you, Ewan. Thank you.
So, yeah, David, I remember your last sermon at St. Peter's Free Church back in 2019. It was, quite an emotional service, I think for you and for many of the people there who obviously had sat under your ministry for many years, seen the growth of the church and the development of the church, and it was a joy to be there actually at the last sermon that you ever preached there. I remember you and I had a conversation. It was the last conversation we had before you left, in which I said to you, I think you'll be surprised by the political and moral transformation of this nation by the time that you come back. And obviously I knew at that point you were thinking of coming back in a few years' time. You said to me, I don't think I will be. And I suppose I'd like to reflect on that question again. We're now 3 years on. Have you been surprised by some of the things that you've seen in Scotland? We've seen a very authoritarian response to lockdown. We have seen a transformation in definitely in the way that we deal with the public and the way that the church has been treated. Lord Braid was very clear that the lockdown of churches, for instance, the closure of churches, which I know is a thing that concerns you, was unlawful. What was your thoughts just on the state of Scotland? Are you surprised by the changes that have taken place over the last few years?
No, not at all. I mean, I don't claim to be the prophet or the son of a prophet, but I think this has got nothing. Well, I was going to say it's got nothing to do with the religion. Actually, it does have something to do with the religion, but I think, you know, as a long-term observer and participant in Scottish politics and life, I was very optimistic about the direction that Scotland was going. Ironically, until the referendum, the independence referendum. And I remember the day that we lost that, because I voted for yes, and I just felt a blackness and a darkness. And then afterwards, I watched in horror as the SNP membership rose from 25,000 to 125,000. And I saw the hubris in... So for me, things like the death of Donald Dewar was a big issue. The sidelining of people like Jim Sillars, who I admired. And, you know, initially I admired Alex Salmond as a politician. I thought he was a brilliant politician. I wasn't sure about Nicola Sturgeon, but I just had this dreadful feeling that, you know, we were going to go down the tubes. And when I was back, I was back in May of this year, and there was just several things that struck me. One was the continued decline of the NHS. The other was the drugs death situation and the appalling situation, which is, you know, in Dundee, I was once assaulted in Dundee by a guy who was, you know, on drugs, and, you know, people shooting up in alleyways, and just the dreadful situation that existed, the poverty. I just found all that. Actually, what struck me going back was how bad the roads were, which was incredible for me, and the sense of despair in so many people, and the growing disillusionment. So I remember, maybe this will help. I remember in campaigning for a yes vote, I'd never seen such political engagement and involvement as in the housing schemes in Dundee during that time. And I thought it was wonderful. And not just there, I mean, up in the Highlands and the villages, I thought it was wonderful. There was a bad side to it, of course, because sometimes people went over the top. But overall, I thought the political engagement was great. But the thought did strike me at the time, if this doesn't happen, or if it does happen and it doesn't work out, then these people are going to be bitterly disappointed. And I think we're going through that now at the moment. My view about Scotland is that it's vying with New Zealand and the state of Victoria in Australia to see who can be the most soft totalitarian in the world. I jokingly referred at one point to Scotland as a mild version of North Korea. You know, that was an exaggeration, but not an entire. You know, it's not entirely false. I regard Scotland as turning into an incredibly authoritarian and, to be honest, quite depressing place. And you know, it needs to be renewed. It needs to be revived. Where the religion bit comes into it, I know that religion can be oppressive and authoritarian. We see that in lots of ways. But I would argue that Scotland's traditional Christianity actually provided a basis for freedom, because it stopped people saying the state is the only authority. Now we've got into a situation where the state is the only authority. So again, one example, and then I'll stop. I don't know if you've seen the clip of the boy in the school, I think it was in Ayr, where the teacher is he's been suspended for saying there wasn't more than two genders.
That's right.
And the teacher says these chilling words. He says, "The authorities say there are more than two genders, and you have to accept that." And I'm going, wow, that a teacher could say that. The authorities say. What if the authorities said that being black made you an inferior human being? Would you? You know, I mean, when the government becomes, you know, the God, when Nicola Sturgeon sees herself as mommy for everybody, it's a disaster, and I despair in that sense. Now, I'm not without hope, but I think the trajectory Scotland has been on for maybe even 2-3 decades, that has only accelerated. And I guess the picture of that just now is my friend David Meredith sending me photos of the rubbish lying in Edinburgh. I think that's symbolic.
It was Aberdeenshire. The school actually.
Okay, it was Aberdeenshire, right?
Yeah, it was. Jamie Gillis and I were actually talking about this school the other day there, and he said that it was the school that he attended while he was growing up.
Yeah.
So yeah, he remembers the teacher because it was his guidance teacher. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree with so much of what you've said there, David, and I mean, one of the interesting thing is you mentioned obviously that you'd campaigned for independence, but you also campaigned 2 years later to leave the European Union, which means you would be described in Scotland as a double ooter. So talk to us about your. I mean, that really is taking a wrecking ball to the political institutions. You know, not only wanting out of Westminster, but wanting out of Brussels. And obviously, that's a position that we, of course, hold to, Elaine and I, and Sovereignty as a party. Talk to us about your reasoning behind your support for leaving the European Union as well as for independence from the UK.
Yeah, okay. Now, I say that these views are my personal political views. I don't claim divine authority for them. You know, I think that Christians disagree, and I've got people who follow my podcast and stuff who say, I can't believe you're for independence, or, you know, I can't believe you're for... No, so my logic is fairly straightforward. I happen to think that it's best if countries... I believe that it should be such a thing as national states. And I happen to believe it's best if countries govern themselves.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, I was for Scotland being independent. I'm not anti the UK, strangely enough, because I did think that United Kingdom overall did a great deal of good. But the foundations on which it was based have largely gone. And my fear for Scotland was that we would live in a country dominated by London and the power of London and the stock market and everything. And I just thought Scotland would be better being independent. I must admit, I looked to the Scandinavian countries, particularly Norway and so on. And then when it came to the EU, instinctively, I was for the EU. In fact, I remember leaving the Labour Party. One of the issues was at that time, it was very anti-EU. I remember joining being a founder member of the Social Democratic Party. And I was very pro-EU, but then, like many people, I actually started looking into it. And I realized that the EU, the fundamental flaw with the EU is it's not democratic. Further, it's not what I thought it was. I had believed, as most people believe, that it was an alliance of independent states who were working together. But the EU is not that. It is what's called a supranational body, where you hand over your sovereignty in many areas to the EU. And in Scotland, we see that particular in fishing. Now, the irony is that the SNP initially in the 1970s got its support from the fishing communities because of its opposition to the EU.
Absolutely.
And now the SNP should not call itself the Scottish National Party. It should call itself the EUNP because it is a European nationalist party. And my view is, why leave one union in order to go into a larger union, which is less democratic, in which we would have less say, and which is more authoritarian? I regard the EU as fundamentally authoritarian, and I would rather be in the UK than in the EU. So, I'm not alone in that. A third of SNP supporters voted for Brexit, and I just get so annoyed with people like Ian Blackford speaking of Scotland's values as though we were one monolithic, as I say, North Korean type people. And Scotland's values, and when I says Scotland wants to be in the EU, well, I didn't really notice that. I noticed the majority of people who voted to be in the EU, but that was about a third of the population. 2/3 of the population either didn't vote or voted against. So, I'm passionately anti-EU because I went and studied it. I as you know, I write a blog, and I did a long blog on the EU, and it's still way and above. I don't think I've ever influenced anything in my life, but I think that my work on the EU did influence some people, because I think when you look at it, it's very, very hard to argue that it's a democratic body of national nations. That's like arguing a circle is square.
Yeah,
for sure.
But David, sorry,
Elaine, on you go.
I was going to ask on that. Like, David, sorry, do you think that people are voting for the SNP now in the numbers that they are because they genuinely want independence for Scotland, or do you think it's because they were non-Brexit voters who are using the SNP as a lifeline to get back into the European Union in the main?
I think why people are voting, there are different reasons. First of all, the majority of people in Scotland didn't vote, even of those who did vote for the SNP at the last election. That's a huge thing. The SNP, when I knew the SNP initially, before Gordon Wilson took over, they were a ragtag group of they were great fun. I mean, you get everything from pretty well fascist to communist. You just get and it was chaotic.
It's a party.
And Gordon, I thought you were just fascist, but I mean, it was absolutely chaotic. And Gordon Wilson, and in particular Alex Salmond, although Gordon Wilson expelled Alex Salmond, which I thought was hilarious because I did Gordon Wilson's funeral. Right. And Alec was there, and I mentioned it during the funeral, and there was a gasp from all the politicians. And the journalist afterwards said to me, "Man, you got balls." Yeah. You should have seen Alec's face, But but they put a discipline. But then they went way over the top. I don't know if this is still the case. But until recently, and I'm sure it is still the case, if you became an SNP elected politician, you had to sign a pledge never to go against any aspect of party policy.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, that's an authoritarian that's unbelievably chilling. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, I knew people in the SNP, for example, and I'm talking about elected politicians, who were for Brexit, but couldn't say so. Yes, now, that's an appalling state to be in. But anyway, coming back as to why people voted, I think you've got about a third of people in Scotland who are probably either very for or on balance for independence. I think you've got a third who are vehemently opposed, and there's the third in the middle. I think when it comes to voting for the SNP, most of those people in the middle do not think they're voting for independence. They think they're voting for Nicola Sturgeon. They think they're voting for the current government. And then the other problem is this, that the Scottish government has become so authoritarian that so many jobs are dependent on their patronage. And although you've got a secret ballot, there's still this sense in which there's let me tell you something that may shock people, but I'm a free church minister, and bizarrely in Scotland, I found myself often speaking up for the Catholics, particularly Catholic schools. And I would speak in Catholic churches on issues like abortion and so on. And so I remember once I had one day where Ian Paisley turned up at my church. I wasn't there because I think he was wanting to buy it, actually.
Right.
And at the same day, I got a phone call from Cardinal Winning thanking me for, and I thought, there's not many ministers in Scotland who are going to get Ian Paisley and Cardinal Winning.
Brilliant. That's a great story.
But I thought that was lovely. But what was fascinating was I had some Catholics from the west of Scotland phone me up one time and say, "David, we really appreciate you speaking out for us because some of our priests won't speak out for us." And I had got to discuss with him, and Alex Salmond was a political genius, and he knew he had to get the Catholic vote away from the Labour Party. So he did. I mean, he really did. But there became a quid pro quo. A lot of the priests became very pro-SNP and teachers in Catholic schools and so on. And I think that it was a kind of, we'll support your charities, if you keep quiet about some of the social issues. And, you know, I think there's been a level of political indoctrination in schools as well as social indoctrination. But here for me is the actual big issue. And the big issue is this. I don't think the SNP, at its leadership, really wants independence now. I think they would have it in the EU, which I don't think is independence, but I don't even think they really want a referendum. I think they're in a position where they are largely a socially progressive party, and I don't think the idea of Scotland as an independent sovereign nation is what drives them. I think being in government is what drives them, and this being seen to be socially progressive and all the virtue signaling is what drives them. So let me give you one other example. And I told, this was who's the education minister now? I can't remember.
Shirley Ann Somerville.
Yes.
Okay, so it's still Shirley Ann. So
no relation to me. Sorry. Carry on.
with the gender stuff, you know, the Gender Recognition Act, I was called in by the Scottish government to meet with the civil servants who were drawing up the bill. And I was in a room with 3 of them, and I said, why am I here? Am I as a representative of the church? And they said, no, because of your blog. You know, you're writing a lot of stuff, and, you know, we want to, and I think they were a bit scared. And so they should have been, because I had MSPs contact me saying, and again, shows you what Scotland is like. They said, we can't say what you say, but carry on saying it, you know, which is just awful. But anyway, I was called in, and these guys said to me, what do you, would you ever support this? I said, no. They said, okay, what would you want from us? And I said, okay, I want 3 things. First of all, you keep this out of schools. You do not teach kids that they can choose their own gender. Secondly, women's spaces. You know, that you've got to protect women's sports, and actually in the SNP, women's quotas and so on for that. You know, because if I said to them, in my local branch, if they say we've got to have a female, I just say, well, I self-designate as a female. You know, and then the third one, I said, I don't want to go to jail for saying that a man cannot become a woman.
Yes.
And you know what they took seriously? It was the third one. They said the third one, that's going to be difficult. So I went to see Shirley Ann Somerville. I met her afterwards, and she had an assistant with her. And we were talking about this, and I said, you know what, if I was going to advise the Tories, which I'm not, but if they took you on this issue, you would lose the next election. Because if you put me in a room with 90% of parents in Scotland and I was debating with you on this issue, I would win. And it would be nothing to do with religion, and it would be nothing to do with prejudice. And do you know what she said to me? And I told her I would not keep this secret because I was so horrified. She actually said to me, that's because parents are ignorant.
Boy.
That describes the patronizing, elitist, middle-class, self-righteous virtue signaling that is in control of the Labour Party. Now, here's the irony. I know that apart from Shirley Ann Somerville and Nicola Sturgeon, I know, or suspect, I shouldn't say I know, but I've been told that all the women leaders in the SNP are opposed to this. So that, again, tells you just a horrifying story.
Yeah.
You know.
But isn't it just if they've bought into the woke agenda because they're frightened to be anything different, or do you think they go along with it completely because they actually genuinely feel that to be the way of progressive politics?
This may be shocking. I mean, there are some politicians who are very intelligent and thoughtful and who know what they're doing. And by the way, I would say one of them is Patrick Harvey. And that makes Patrick Harvey far more dangerous than a lot of the other politicians, because Harvey knows what he's doing. I debated Patrick Harvey on the same-sex marriage thing, and I knew exactly where he was coming from and what he was doing. But there are other politicians who are not that smart. I'm sorry to shock you. You know,
it's not a shock.
They just go along with stuff, you know.
Yeah.
And then there are people who understand, but they're cowards because they don't want to pay a price. and there would be a price. There are people I admire. Joanne Cherry, for example, the way that she has been treated is absolutely shocking. I mean, really shocking. And I think she's a very brave woman. I don't agree with her with a lot of stuff, but I look at her. I think the way that Kate Forbes is treated is really quite shocking. I remember the SNP convener for education in Dundee, you will remember, who eventually got fired because the feminists took him on, But I remember having a Twitter spat with him, and he said, "Don't call me he." I said, "Okay, I'll call you she." He said, "Don't call me she." I said, "What do you want me to call me? Zize Zer or something?" And I said, "Oh, for goodness sake." So I said to him, "Do you know what? I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll call you whatever you want, but you have to give me my pronouns." He said, "Well, what are they?" I said, "Well, I identify as a Christian. So every time you refer to me, you have to say beloved in Christ." And you can say beloved for short. So my pronoun is beloved. Well, I didn't hear from him again. I did get a lot of abuse, but he was incredibly abusive on social media. And here's the thing. He was in charge of the education of Dundee's children. That was astonishing to me, astonishing. So I think people vote because, I also think, by the way, often people will vote for individual politicians. So people will vote for Kate Forbes, or they'll vote. The Liberal Democrats used to do this. The Liberal Democrats used to have very good local councillors. Like in the West End of Dundee, I would have no qualm in voting for the local Lib Dem councillor because they did their jobs. They were good at it. And so people will often vote for the personality. Sometimes they just vote for the status quo, the party in government. And sometimes there are people who are ideologues. And they're the ones to be wary of because they're the ones who will get bitterly disappointed.
Yeah. Well, you'll be glad. Yeah, I mean, you'll be glad to know the Liberal Democrats now have 2 councillors in the West End where St Peter's Free Church resides. And it's entirely because, Fraser McPherson, you speak to many of the people that vote for him, and they're very fond of him because he hand delivers his leaflets, because he talks to them about ordinary issues that they're facing, and that's obviously a large part of the reason why they now have 2 councillors in that area. And I know that's the same. Obviously, Elaine has Craig Duncan as her local Lib Dem councillor, and again, a guy who's really well embedded. But wanted to come back to this issue that you raised, David, because you're right. In your blog, you were one of the early. One of these early voices in around 2015, 2016, when the SNP membership had swelled to well over 100,000, you were one of the first to challenge the fact that they were pro-independence. And I like that you've raised that again now, because that is becoming a much more mainstream opinion. It wasn't in 2015 or 2016, but even there are some within the SNP ranks and who are not only supporters and voters, but members who I know and who I regularly speak to, even in my own community. Some of my neighbours say that they are thoroughly convinced that the SNP is no longer interested in independence, and as you say, are much more interested in power. Talk to us a little bit about that. I mean, there is this vice-like grip on Scottish politics, but we are in this situation where Nicola Sturgeon says she's pursuing a referendum in October of 2023. It's very likely that the Supreme Court will tell us that that's obviously not going to be possible to hold that, or it's certainly not going to have any international standing. What's your thoughts on the cause of independence at this moment and where it is?
Well, my view, contrary to what the London press were saying, and it's amazing how the Scottish Nationalists leadership have gone along with the London press, but contrary to what the Guardian and others were saying, my view is that after the Brexit election, independence became a lot less likely. And that was because I knew that the SNP were going to treat with disdain those of us who voted against. And, when you think about the disaster that there has been, I think economically, COVID, lots of other things, Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, and the fact that independence is still to be honest, it's probably around 45% of those who would vote, but in reality, much less. Nowhere near. I knew SNP strategists after 2014. They knew that they had to be at 60% in the polls for independence before they could win a referendum. Because you get the don't knows, you get the status quo and all that kind of stuff. And you get the Project Fear campaigning. Now, the irony, of course, is that the SNP are absolutely brilliant at Project Fear all the time. And the Scottish government have got this wonderful situation where they're in power to some degree, but they can blame Westminster for everything that goes wrong. And so it's power without responsibility. Mm-hmm. And I'm afraid that there are just gullible people who just believe that and who will continue to vote for them, whatever. But I honestly think their bubble will burst. I think that the alliance with the Greens is a total disaster.
Yeah.
The thought of a Greens, the Greens in charge of Scotland. Having this, apart from the fascists, I think I've voted for every party in Scotland at some point. And including the Greens, but the Greens have gone crazy.
Yeah.
I see all of that, and I just think it's a mess.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll just ask you a subsequent question on that, and I'll hand back to Elaine in just a moment. But I think you're right. The Green Cooperation Agreement or coalition has been quite an interesting one. To think that Patrick Harvey, who, as you say, you were debating with back in 2013, is now a minister in the Scottish government is quite a remarkable situation. That a party that were fourth in the polls are now have two ministers. But I suppose one of the questions I wanted to put to you, David, is again regarding this trajectory of in Scotland. Where do you think what do you think will be the thing that will break the vice-like grip of the SNP, and who do you think will be the replacement?
I think what will break the vice-like grip of the SNP is the transgender issue. And I would also say education and the NHS. So if the SNP had listened to Alex Neil, they would have reformed the NHS. Alex Neil had great ideas. If they'd listened to Gordon Wilson, they would have reformed their views of the EU. But the big one, the absolute big one, is education, because the SNP have turned Scotland's schools into social engineering classes. We used to be famous for our education. We were the land of the people of the book. And then we're in a state now where 1 in 5 Scots is functionally illiterate. And I think education. Now, I would also add, in terms of various things, poverty. And what I mean by that is I object really strongly to giving middle-class subsidies from the state. I think that the SNP has not been good for the poor. And that for me was the final straw. I decided I wouldn't vote for them again, because I just thought the way I see the poor being used and abused. So I'm here in Australia, for example, and I pay for my prescriptions and I pay to go to the doctor, and we've got a far better healthcare service. And I think, well, I can afford to pay. Why shouldn't I? The poor shouldn't have to pay. And it's the same thing with so many other things. And I think the Scottish government has become a government of, I'm sorry, but the central elites, if you like, the urban elites. And I think that, I think they do some good work. I wouldn't be entirely negative about everything, but on the big issues, I think they're leading Scotland into a very, very dangerous route. And one of the reasons I should have said that I think they get voted in is because the opposition's been so poor. The Tories, I cannot believe how bad the Tories have been. I'm not anti-Tory either. I think people like Murdo Fraser, and there are others who've been absolutely excellent. But talk about lacking leadership. I don't know enough about Anna Sarawar, but I'm there's a possibility that Labour could come back. I don't know. But I kind of, you guys in sovereignty, I hope smaller parties keep plugging away, because I think there's an opportunity to influence things.
Yeah.
So would you say then that, I mean, talking about the Sovereignty Party, I mean, there obviously are quite a number of smaller parties now popping up. How do you see, just with your experience in politics over the years, and, obviously the SNP were a very small party, ragtag bunch, as you said, have now become the most powerful one in Scotland, for example. How do you see things going with the independence debate, generally speaking? Do you feel it's going to have to take something quite different to actually finally get this across the line? Or do you think that perhaps, despite everything, despite what we might think about Nicola Sturgeon, whether she's still and the party want to get independence, whether the fact that she's now pegged everything on this, that we might just get it over the line with the SNP? And then if we do, what do you see happening after that potentially?
No, we won't get it over the line. The last thing Nicola wants is a referendum, and the last thing she expects is to win it. I think she's entirely cynical about this. It basically what she does. She's got 100,000 troops to feed, and we demand a referendum. We demand this every single year since 2017. Nicola has said next year, next year, next year, next year, and next year she'll be saying next year. Next year, she'll also be going, "Oh, Westminster won't let us have it," and all that kind of stuff. It's an absolute nonsense. So there won't be a referendum. Nicola Sturgeon is pretty well the best ally that the unionists can have, because she's an EU unionist. So my view that the hard thing now is for parties like yours and other people to say, actually, small nations being independent in today's world is not impossible, and it can actually be a good thing. Real independence. We don't have to belong to a bloc, and let's put it this way. I'm never going to fight for an EU army. I'm not even sure I'd fight for a UK army, but that's another question. But I would never fight in an EU army. And I think the way that Nicola Sturgeon's going, it's not even just that it's progressivism, it's corporate progressivism. It relies on the wealthy corporations. Alex Salmond did this in terms of meeting with business people. You could say it's fair enough, but I just think that you'll find that the most woke groups in Western society right now are the big capitalist companies. And my view is that as long as the SNP are in charge of Scotland, independence will not happen.
It could be argued, actually, that it is the big corporates, really, that run the whole show in every political party in every country in the world at the end of the day, because they have become so powerful, along with big tech, of course, swaying voting.
Well, I think they have. And I would say the corporates and big tech are more or less the same thing. But I would say that's certainly the case with the woke agenda and everything else.
Yeah.
But that's where the populist movements, and it's so funny seeing left-wing people being against being popular, and populist, that associated with being right-wing. My argument would be, there are far-right nutcases. My studies at university were in history, particularly Weimar Germany. The German Nazis and the German communists were miles apart from each other, and yet they were next-door neighbors. They were very close. A lot of communists became Nazis and so on, because they feed off one another. And I think the kind of what we need in Scotland is a more moderate and yet radical politics, in which the big issues, we get back to the big issues. The big issues in Scotland have got to be education and healthcare. That's and I would say justice in terms of poverty. I mean, when I started off in politics, I was kind of very left-wing, and it was being left-wing then meant you were concerned for economic justice. Now being left-wing, you can be a billionaire and be left-wing. In fact, most of them are, because being left-wing means you're socially progressive and you think a man can become a woman. And, drag queens are suitable means for it. That's you being progressive and left-wing. I mean, the companies here in the CBD in Sydney, when it's Pride Day, they're all vying with themselves to have stalls and everything. And yet we've got, for example, the Commonwealth Bank here, which is the most woke of all the banks. The CEO complained about workers getting pay rises in Australia and awarded himself a 37% pay rise. So he's only getting paid 10 million a year or something, and yet they still go on about how progressive they are. And those are the people who Nicola Sturgeon relies on.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And I loathe it. I mean, I absolutely loathe it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, David, I think we're going to have to draw this to a close because you need to get away. But final question for you. It's a quick one. When are you coming back?
Do you know, I was back in May, and this is how much, and I mean, I knew things would change, but I felt this immense sorrow that I was like in exile, and I felt that the door was closed to me. And I honestly believe this. I believe if I came back to Scotland, there is a risk, a large risk of me being prosecuted by a government which seeks to impose its ideology upon everybody. So yeah, I mean, I've got my house up in the Highlands. I do want to come back. I think I'll be here for another, couple of years. And then I'll tell you what, I'll come back when sovereignty are running the country, okay?
I'll tell you what, mate, our first act in government would be to repeal the loathsome Hate Crime and Public Order Act. So there you go. I put it out on a podcast. I may well be prosecuted for that, but let me tell you what, David, you would be welcome back anytime to come and speak to our members. I mean, you're one of them, so come and speak to the members.
Listen, my aim is to come back for a month every year anyway, so I'll let you know when I'm coming back. And honestly, I pray that God would bless you in what you're doing. I think Scotland needs more variety in politics. I think you provide part of that. I hope people will take you seriously. And, even if you don't get loads of people elected, at least have a voice, and have a voice collectively. I think that's important.
For sure. That's a good point to stop, David. Thank you so much for your time, for getting up early. You're 6:30 in the morning. It's late at night here, but thank you very much for doing that, and have a great day. And we'll speak to you again soon, David.
All right.
Thank you.
Right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.